They were told the Americans would separate families, tear children from their mothers, and send the elderly to die alone. But when American soldiers approached the line of German refugees at a processing camp in Bavaria, May 1945, they encountered something they had not expected. An old woman, white-haired and bone-thin, clutched a small girl so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. The child's face was buried in her grandmother's coat, and the old woman's eyes held a fierce, desperate light. "Don't take her from me," the grandmother whispered in broken English, then louder, pleading, Please don't take her from me." Her voice cracked with terror. The soldier stopped. He looked at the trembling child, no more than 7 years old, then at the grandmother, who seemed ready to fight the entire U.S. Army with nothing but her frail arms. What happened next would challenge everything both the Americans and the Germans believed about each other. Before we continue with this remarkable story, if you appreciate these forgotten moments of human connection during history's darkest hours, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories deserve to be remembered. The war in Europe had ended just weeks earlier, but the chaos of defeat was far from over. Across the German countryside, millions of people moved like ghosts through the ruins of their shattered nation. Roads choked with refugees stretched for miles in every direction. Women pulled carts loaded with everything they owned. Children walked with feet wrapped in rags. Old men leaned on canes made from broken fence posts. And everywhere the smell of smoke still hung in the air from cities that had burned weeks or months before. Margaret Hoffman was 68 years old, though she looked older. Years of war rationing had carved deep lines into her face and left her body thin as a scarecrow. Her gray hair, once carefully pinned and proper, now hung loose beneath a dirty headscarf. Her coat, which had been good wool before the war, was patched at the elbows and missing 2 buttons. But none of that mattered to her now. The only thing that mattered was the small hand clasped tightly in her own. Sophie was 7 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, though Margaret tried not to think about that. The child's dress, once blue with white flowers, was now gray from weeks of travel and washing in cold streams. Her shoes were too small, pinching her toes, but they were the only shoes she had. A small doll made of rags was clutched in her free hand, its button eyes hanging loose from threads. They had been walking for 3 weeks, ever since the Americans had come through their village. Margaret's home was gone, burned in the fighting. Her daughter, Sophie's mother, was dead, killed in an air raid 6 months earlier in Dresden, where she had gone to find work. Her son-in-law had died on the Eastern Front 2 years before that. There was no one left but Margaret and Sophie. 2 survivors in a nation of survivors, all of them moving west toward the American occupation zones because everyone said the Americans were better than the Russians. The processing camp appeared on the horizon like a strange city of canvas and wood. Rows of white tents stretched across what had once been farmland. Guard towers stood at intervals, though the guards seemed relaxed, almost bored. Barbed wire fences marked the perimeter, but they seemed more for organization than imprisonment. Trucks rumbled in and out, kicking up clouds of dust that made the refugees cough. American flags snapped in the May wind, red and white and blue, bright and clean in a landscape of gray. As they approached the gates, Margaret's senses were overwhelmed by details that seemed impossible. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the smell of death and smoke that had followed them for weeks, but something different. Something that made her stomach clench with sudden painful hunger. Bread. Real bread baking somewhere inside the camp. And coffee. The rich, bitter smell of real coffee. Not the acorn substitute they had been drinking for years. The sounds were different too. American soldiers called to each other in English, their voices casual, almost cheerful. Someone was playing music from a radio, the sound tiny but clear. Jazz, she thought, though she had not heard such music in years. The Reich had called it degenerate, forbidden it, but here it played openly in the afternoon sun. Generators hummed steadily, providing power for lights and equipment. The rumble of truck engines came and went in a rhythm that spoke of order, organization, efficiency. Visually, the contrast was jarring. The American soldiers looked clean. That was the first thing that struck her. There, uniforms were pressed, their faces shaved, their boots polished. They did not look like men who had just fought a war. They looked like they were attending a parade. Some of them were smoking cigarettes, real cigarettes, not the dried leaf mixtures Germans had been reduced to. Others were drinking from bottles of Coca-Cola, a luxury so distant from Margaret's reality that it seemed like something from a dream. The refugees around her moved slowly, shuffling forward in a long, quiet line. No one spoke much. They were all too exhausted, too nervous about what came next. Mothers held children close. Old men clutched their identification papers with trembling hands. Everyone had heard stories, terrible stories about what happened to prisoners, about separation and deportation and death. No one knew which stories to believe. Sophie pressed closer to her grandmother's side, her small fingers digging into Margaret's palm. The child had barely spoken in days, not since they had passed through a village where they had seen Russian soldiers. The fear had not left her eyes since then. "Ma," Sophie whispered, using the German word for grandmother. "I'm scared." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "I know, Liing, but we stay together. No matter what happens, we stay together. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded, her dark eyes wide and solemn. At 7 years old, she had already learned that the world was dangerous, that safety was temporary, that the adults who promised to protect you could disappear without warning. She had learned not to trust promises, but she trusted her ma. That was all she had left. They reached the gate. An American soldier, young, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles across his nose, looked at them with something that might have been pity. He said something in English that Margaret did not understand, then gestured for them to move forward into the processing area. His tone was not cruel. That surprised her. She had expected cruelty, cruelty she could understand, could brace herself against. But this casual kindness, this almost gentle direction, confused her and made her more nervous. Around them, other families were being separated into groups. Men to one side, women to another, children being counted and recorded. Margaret's heart began to pound hard in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading. This was when they would try to take Sophie away. Her grip on Sophie's hand tightened until the child whimpered softly. Margaret forced herself to loosen her hold slightly, but she did not let go. She would not let go. She could not. Sophie was all she had left in the world, the last living piece of her daughter, the last reason to keep breathing. An older American soldier, maybe 40, with sergeant's stripes on his uniform and tired eyes that had seen too much, began moving down the line of women. He was checking papers, asking questions in simple German, some questions about names, ages, where they had come from. He carried a clipboard and made notes as people answered. His manner was efficient, but not unkind. That, too, confused Margaret. She had been told the Americans would be harsh, vindictive, cruel. This man seemed merely tired and perhaps a little overwhelmed by the endless stream of refugees. The moment arrived. The sergeant stopped in front of Margaret and Sophie. He looked down at his clipboard, then at them, his gaze moving from the old woman to the child and back again. He opened his mouth to speak, and Margaret felt her entire body tense like a spring wound too tight. Every muscle prepared to fight, though she had no strength to fight with. Every nerve screamed, "Danger!" This was the moment. This was when everything would fall apart. "Name?" the sergeant asked in German, his accent heavy but understandable. "Margaret Hoffman," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear rushing through her veins. "And this is Sophie, my granddaughter." The sergeant made notes on his clipboard. He did not look up as he asked the next question. "Ages?" 68. She is 7. "Parents?" The question was routine, mechanical. The sergeant had asked it 1,000 times that day. Margaret's throat tightened. "Dead. Both dead. I am all she has." Now the sergeant did look up. His eyes met Margaret's and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps understanding? He had probably heard this answer many times today as well. Germany was full of orphans and widows now. "The child should go to the children's section," he said not unkindly. "We have a special area for unaccompanied minors. Better food, better beds." She'll be well cared for. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her vision narrowed, her breath caught in her chest. The world seemed to tilt sideways. She heard Sophie's sharp intake of breath, felt the child press against her leg, trembling. No. The word came out as a whisper. The sergeant frowned slightly. Ma'am, I understand, but the children's section. No. Louder now. Margaret pulled Sophie behind her, her frail body attempting to shield the child from the soldier, from the clipboard, from the entire American army. Her hands shook, but her voice grew stronger. She stays with me. She is not unaccompanied. I am here. She is not alone. Other refugees in the line were staring now. The sergeant looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, please understand. The children's area has better. I don't care. Margaret's voice rose, carrying across the processing area. Several other soldiers turned to look. Sophie began to cry, silent tears streaming down her small face, her arms wrapped around her grandmother's waist. You cannot take her. I won't let you. I walked 3 weeks to keep her safe. 3 weeks. We slept in ditches. We ate grass when we had nothing else. I carried her when she could not walk. You cannot take her from me now. The sergeant held up his hands, palms out, trying to calm her. But Margaret was beyond calm. She dropped to her knees, pulling Sophie with her, her arms wrapping around the child in a grip that would have taken crowbars to break. She looked up at the American soldier with eyes that blazed with something beyond fear, beyond desperation. It was the look of a woman who had lost everything else, and could not lose this one last thing. Bah, she said, switching to German in her distress, tears now streaming down her weathered face. She is all I have. All I have left of my daughter. All I have left in this world. Please, please don't take her from me. Sophie sobbed against her grandmother's shoulder, her small voice breaking as she cried, Oma, over and over, clinging with the strength that only terrified children possess. The processing area had grown quiet. Other refugees watched with the helpless empathy of people who understood exactly what was happening, who feared the same thing happening to them. American soldiers shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to handle this situation. This was not covered in their training. They knew how to fight. They knew how to follow orders. They did not know what to do with a weeping grandmother who refused to release her grandchild. The sergeant with the clipboard looked at the old woman kneeling in the dust, arms locked around a sobbing child, and something changed in his face. He had seen so much in this war, so much death, so much destruction. He had watched cities burn and soldiers die. He had liberated concentration camps and seen horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And here, in a dusty processing camp on a spring afternoon, he was making a grandmother and child cry because of a rule about separate quarters. He looked down at his clipboard. Then he looked back at Margaret and Sophie. Then he did something that was either against regulations or a creative interpretation of them, depending on who you asked. He knelt down too, bringing himself to their level. When he spoke, his voice was softer. Ma'am, Mrs. Hoffman, look at me, please. Margaret raised her tear-stained face, expecting to see anger or impatience. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like kindness. Listen to me carefully, the sergeant said, speaking slowly in his heavily accented German. I am going to mark on this paper that Sophie is in your care, that you are her legal guardian. Do you understand? You will stay together. I will make sure of it. Margaret stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. Her arms remained locked around Sophie. I promise, the sergeant continued. You will not be separated. You will go to the same quarters, eat together, sleep together. No one will take her from you. You have my word. Your word? Margaret's voice was barely audible. My word? I'm Sergeant Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell from Ohio. I have a mother back home about your age and a niece about Sophie's age. I give you my word, Mrs. Hoffman. No one will separate you from your granddaughter. Slowly, very slowly, Margaret's desperate grip began to loosen slightly. Sophie's sobs quieted to hiccups. The child peeked out from behind her grandmother's shoulder at the American sergeant with the tired eyes and the kind voice. "Do you believe me?" Sergeant Mitchell asked. Margaret did not know if she believed him. She did not know if she could believe him, but she saw something in his face that reminded her that he was human. Not just enemy, not just occupier, but a man who had made a promise. And in that moment, kneeling in the dust of a refugee camp, she chose to believe because the alternative was to remain frozen in fear forever. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe you." Sergeant Mitchell stood and offered his hand to help Margaret to her feet. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. His hand was warm and strong, and he lifted her gently as if she were made of glass. Sophie clung to her grandmother's coat, her face still buried against the worn fabric, but her crying had stopped. The sergeant made notes on his clipboard, then handed Margaret a card with numbers written on it. "This is your identification number. Keep it safe. You'll need it for meals and housing assignments. Stay together, stay in line, and you'll be fine." He gestured to another soldier, a younger man, who approached with a careful expression. "Reynolds, take Mrs. Hoffman and her granddaughter through the medical check. Make sure they're marked as a family unit together through the whole process. Understood?" Private Reynolds nodded quickly. "Yes, Sergeant. Together the whole way." Margaret wanted to thank the sergeant, but the words stuck in her throat. How do you thank someone for not taking away the only thing you have left? How do you express gratitude for basic human decency? Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes meeting his one more time. He nodded back, a small gesture of understanding, then moved on to the next family in line. Private Reynolds led them toward a large tent marked with a red cross. "Medical examination," he explained in halting German. "Just to make sure you're healthy. Nothing to worry about." Sophie's hand was still clamped in Margaret's, and the old woman made no move to release it. They entered the tent together, and the smell of antiseptic washed over them. A nurse, a woman in an American uniform with captain's bars on her collar, looked up from a desk. "Family unit?" she asked Reynolds in English. "Grandmother and granddaughter. Sergeant's orders. They stay together through processing." The nurse nodded and smiled at Sophie. It was a genuine smile, warm and kind, and it made Sophie press even closer to her grandmother. Kindness from strangers felt dangerous. Kindness from the enemy felt impossible. The medical examination was thorough, but gentle. The nurse checked their eyes, their throats, listened to their hearts and lungs. She noted Margaret's malnutrition, the way her bones pressed against her skin, the gray pallor of someone who had not eaten properly in months. She noted Sophie's better condition, but still saw the signs of chronic hunger and stress. The child flinched at every touch, every movement. Her body tensed for flight or pain. "They need food," the nurse said to Private Reynolds. "Get them through dowsing and then straight to the mess tent. The child especially needs protein." Dowsing. The word made Margaret stiffen. She had heard stories about this too. Terrible stories about humiliation and degradation. But she followed Private Reynolds to another tent. Sophie's hand still clutched in hers because what choice did she have? The American had promised they would stay together. She had to trust that promise now. The dowsing tent was staffed by women, more American nurses and clean uniforms. They handed Margaret and Sophie bars of soap, real soap that smelled like flowers. They gave them towels, white and clean and soft. They pointed to shower stalls and mimed washing motions, their faces kind and patient. Together, Margaret asked in German, gesturing to herself and Sophie. "We stay together." One of the nurses seemed to understand. She nodded vigorously. "Yes, yes. Together. No separate." Her German was terrible, but the meaning was clear. They entered a shower stall together. Margaret helping Sophie undress, then undressing herself. Their clothes, worn and filthy from weeks of travel, were taken away to be cleaned or burned. For a moment, standing naked and vulnerable, Margaret felt a surge of panic. But then the water came on hot and clean, and all thought disappeared in the shocking pleasure of warmth. Margaret washed Sophie first, gently scrubbing months of dirt and fear from the child's skin. Sophie stood quietly, letting her grandmother work, her eyes closed against the water. When Margaret worked the soap through Sophie's hair, the child made a small sound that might have been contentment. It had been so long since either of them had been truly clean. Then Margaret washed herself, and the act of becoming clean felt like becoming human again. The dirt that had worked into every crease of her skin, the grime that had become part of her, all of it washed away down the drain. She scrubbed until her skin was pink, until she felt raw and new. Tears mixed with the water on her face. But they were different tears now. Not tears of fear, but tears of relief so overwhelming it bordered on pain. When they emerged from the showers, clean clothes were waiting. Not their own clothes, but simple dresses, clean and serviceable. They were too big, hanging loose on their thin frames, but they were clean, and they smelled of soap and sun. Sophie looked down at herself in wonder, touching the fabric as if she did not quite believe it was real. Private Reynolds was waiting outside the Ealing tent. He looked at them with approval. Much better. Now, let's get you two something to eat. The mess tent was enormous, filled with long tables and benches. The smell that hit them when they entered made Margaret's knees go weak. Real food, not the watery cabbage soup they had been surviving on. Not the rock-hard bread made from sawdust. Real food cooking in huge pots. The smell of meat and potatoes and vegetables filling the air. They joined the line of refugees moving slowly toward the serving area. Sophie pressed against Margaret's side, her eyes wide as she stared at the soldiers serving food from behind a long counter. One of them, a big man with a friendly face, smiled at Sophie as they approached. "Hello there, little one," he said in English. Sophie did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was not angry. He was not cruel. He was kind. He filled 2 trays with food. Real food. Margaret stared at the portions with disbelief. There was beef, actual slices of roasted beef. There were mashed potatoes, smooth and white and steaming. There were green beans cooked with butter. There was bread, soft white bread that smelled like heaven. There was even butter for the bread and jam and milk for Sophie and coffee. Real coffee, hot and dark. Margaret's hands shook as she took the tray. It was so heavy, so much food, more food than she had seen in one place in years. She looked at the soldier serving the food, certain there must be some mistake. This could not be real. This could not be for them. But he just smiled and gestured for them to move along, to find seats. Other refugees were already eating, some crying as they ate, others eating in stunned silence. Margaret found a spot at the end of a long table and sat down carefully, Sophie sliding onto the bench beside her. For a long moment, they just stared at the food. Sophie looked up at her grandmother, uncertain, asking permission with her eyes. Margaret nodded slowly, and Sophie picked up her fork with a small, trembling hand. The first bite of beef made Sophie's eyes go wide. She chewed slowly as if afraid to swallow, as if the food might disappear if she ate too quickly. Then she swallowed and reached for another piece and another. Margaret watched her granddaughter eat, watched color begin to return to the child's pale cheeks, and felt something break open in her chest. She picked up her own fork and took a bite of potato. It was smooth and rich, flavored with butter and salt. It tasted like something from another life, from before the war, from when the world had made sense. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to cry, not to break down completely in the middle of the mess tent. Around them, other refugees ate in the same stunned silence. This was not what they had expected. They had expected punishment, retribution, cruelty. Instead, they were being fed, well fed, better than they had been fed by their own government in years. The contradiction was staggering. Sophie drank her milk, leaving a white mustache on her upper lip. She looked at her grandmother and smiled. Actually smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's good, Ma." Margaret reached over and gently wiped the milk from Sophie's lip with her thumb. "Yes, Liang, it is good." They ate until they could eat no more, until their shrunken stomachs protested at the unaccustomed fullness. Even then there was food left on their trays. Good food. Wasted. Margaret thought of her daughter, dead in Dresden, who had gone to find work because there was no food at home. She thought of her son-in-law, dead on the frozen Eastern Front, who had written letters about being so hungry he could not sleep. And here she sat, the enemy's prisoner, with food left uneaten on her plate because she was too full. The guilt was crushing, but the relief was stronger. Sophie had eaten. Sophie was safe. They were together. That was all that mattered. Everything else, all the confusion and guilt and gratitude and shame, could be sorted out later. For now, this moment, they were together and fed and clean. It was more than she had dared to hope for. After the meal, Private Reynolds took them to their quarters. The camp was organized into sections with different areas for different groups. He led them to a section marked for families, a cluster of wooden barracks with clean, swept paths between them. Inside the barrack, rows of bunk beds lined the walls. It was simple, clean, orderly. Other women and children were already settling in, claiming beds, organizing their few possessions. Private Reynolds led Margaret and Sophie to 2 beds side by side. Lower bunks that would be easier for the old woman to manage. "Here," he said. "These are yours. Blankets are in the trunk at the end of each bed. Bathroom facilities are in the building behind this one. Meals are at 7 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. Roll call is at 8 each morning. Stay inside the family section unless you're assigned work detail." He paused, looking at them with an expression that might have been sympathy. "If you need anything, if anyone gives you trouble, you ask for Sergeant Mitchell. He told me to tell you that. You ask for him specifically. Understand?" Margaret nodded. "Danke. Thank you." The private nodded back and left. Margaret and Sophie stood beside their beds, looking at them as if they might disappear. Real beds with real mattresses. Blankets that were clean and whole. Pillows. Actual pillows. Sophie climbed onto her bed carefully, as if testing whether it would hold her. She bounced slightly and a small smile crossed her face. "Ma, it's soft." Margaret sat on her own bed and felt tears prick at her eyes again. She was so tired of crying. But this was too much. All of it. Too much kindness from people who were supposed to be the enemy. Too much care from soldiers who were supposed to hate them. Nothing made sense anymore. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. The rhythm of captivity, but also the rhythm of survival. Of slowly learning to breathe again without constant fear. Each morning, a bell rang at 6:30. Margaret would wake disoriented for a moment, forgetting where she was. Then she would hear Sophie's breathing from the bed beside her, and memory would return. They would dress in their clean clothes, wash their faces in the bathroom building where there was running water, actual running water from taps, and join the line for morning roll call. Roll call was simple. Names were read, people responded, and that was that. No one was beaten for responding too slowly. No one was punished for being sick or tired. The American soldiers conducting roll call looked bored, routine, as if this were the most mundane part of their day. Breakfast followed. Always hot, always generous. Porridge with sugar and milk, toast with butter, sometimes eggs, always coffee for the adults, and milk for the children. Sophie began to fill out almost immediately, her small face becoming rounder, her arms less stick-thin. Margaret ate more slowly, her body taking longer to adjust. But even she began to feel stronger as the days passed. After breakfast, the adults were sometimes assigned light work details. Margaret, because of her age, was mostly assigned to mending or laundry. She sat with other German women in a long workroom, sewing buttons back onto uniforms or darning socks. It was peaceful work, repetitive and calm. The women talked quietly as they worked, sharing stories, comparing experiences. Sophie was sent to what the Americans called a day program. It was essentially a school, though no one called it that. There were other children, maybe 30 of them, ranging in age from 5 to 12. An American woman, a teacher from somewhere in New England, taught them basic English phrases and organized games. The children were shy at first, traumatized and quiet, But slowly they began to play, to laugh, to be children again. The first time Margaret heard Sophie laugh, really laugh, she stopped breathing for a moment. It was afternoon, and she was walking past the children's area when she heard it. A bright, genuine sound of childish joy. She turned and saw Sophie running in a circle with other children playing some game that involved a ball. The child's face was flushed with exercise and pleasure, her dark hair flying behind her. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth and turned away before anyone could see her cry. But these were different tears. These were tears of relief so profound it felt like drowning and being saved at the same time. Lunch was at noon, always substantial. Soup and sandwiches, usually with fruit when it was available. The fruit was what amazed people most. Apples, oranges, sometimes bananas shipped in from somewhere far away. Many of the children had never seen a banana before. Sophie held hers like it was a treasure, unsure how to eat it, until an American soldier showed her how to peel it. Afternoons were slower, more work for some, rest for others. The old and sick were encouraged to rest, to recover their strength. Margaret often sat in the sun outside the barrack, watching the camp function around her. American soldiers came and went, trucks delivered supplies. The routine was steady, predictable, almost boring in its normalcy. And that was perhaps the strangest thing, the boredom. For years, life had been dramatic, terrifying, uncertain. Every day had brought new dangers, new fears. Now, in the enemy's prison camp, life was routine, safe, dull. It was disorienting. The mail system started in their third week at the camp. The Americans had established a system for refugees to write letters home, to try to locate missing family members, to let people know they were alive. Margaret sat with a pencil and paper staring at the blank page for a long time before she began to write. She wrote to her sister in Hamburg, not knowing if her sister was even alive, not knowing if the letter would reach her. She kept the letter simple, factual. Sophie and I are alive. We are in an American camp in Bavaria. We are well. Please write if you receive this. She did not mention the food. She did not mention the soap, or the clean beds, or the kindness of Sergeant Mitchell. How could she explain those things without sounding like she was grateful to the enemy? How could she describe comfort while her country lay in ruins? 3 weeks later, a letter came back. Her sister was alive, living in the ruins of Hamburg, surviving on rations provided by the British occupation forces. The letter was brief, the handwriting shaky. Thank God you are alive. We feared the worst. Hamburg is destroyed. Nothing is left. We live in the basement of what used to be a school. There are 30 of us in 3 rooms. We have enough to survive. Nothing more. Klaus died in March. Hunger and pneumonia. Tell Sophie her uncle thought of her at the end. Stay safe. Stay together. We will rebuild somehow. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it away. Klaus dead. Her sister's husband, a good man, a kind man, dead from hunger, while she sat in an American camp eating beef and potatoes. The guilt was like acid in her throat. That night, she could barely eat dinner. Sophie noticed and looked up at her with worried eyes. "Ma, are you sick?" "No, Liang. Just tired." The lie came easily. How could she explain to a 7-year-old the weight of survivor's guilt? How could she make a child understand that being safe felt like betrayal? Other letters arrived in the camp bringing similar news. Cities destroyed, families scattered, loved ones dead from bombing, from hunger, from disease. The German people were suffering, truly suffering, and here in the camps run by the victorious Allies, the refugees were fed and clothed and cared for with a generosity that made no sense. Margaret began to pay closer attention to their captors. She watched the American soldiers move through the camp, noted their casual confidence, their easy laughter. They seemed so young, so unburdened. They did not look like men who had just fought through years of brutal war. They looked like they were on some strange kind of camping trip. She watched them share cigarettes, toss footballs, listen to their radios that played that strange American music, jazz and swing. She watched them treat each other with a rough camaraderie that seemed genuine. And she watched how they treated the refugees with a mixture of pity and distance, but rarely with cruelty. Some soldiers were kinder than others. Sergeant Mitchell checked on them regularly, always asking if they needed anything, if they were being treated well. He brought Sophie candy sometimes, chocolate bars that he said were part of his rations. Sophie learned to say thank you in English, carefully pronouncing the words the way he had taught her. There was a young private named Danny who was assigned to the children's program. He had a gentle way with the traumatized kids, never pushing them, always patient. He taught them American songs and played simple games. Sophie adored him, and Margaret watched with a mixture of gratitude and unease as her granddaughter learned to trust again. But there were reminders, too, that they were prisoners, that this was not home, that the Americans were not friends. The barbed wire fence around the camp, though low and unmenacing, was still there. The guard towers, though the guards seemed relaxed, still stood watch. They could not leave. They were confined, controlled, managed. And there were some soldiers who looked at them with undisguised contempt, who saw them not as refugees, but as Nazis, as the enemy, as people responsible for a war that had killed their brothers and friends. Those soldiers did not hurt them, did not violate the rules, but their cold stares were reminder enough that hatred had not disappeared just because the shooting had stopped. One afternoon, a group of American civilians visited the camp. They were from some church group, bringing donations of clothes and toys. They walked through with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to disgust. One woman, well-dressed and middle-aged, stopped near where Margaret was sitting. "These are Germans?" she asked the soldier escorting the group. She said it like she was asking if they were vermin. "Yes, ma'am. Refugees, mostly women and children." The woman looked at Margaret with cold eyes. "They should be grateful we don't treat them the way they treated people." Margaret dropped her gaze, feeling the weight of that judgment. What could she say? That she had never hurt anyone. That she had not supported the Reich. Would it matter? Would this woman believe her? Would anyone? The truth was more complicated than guilt or innocence. Margaret had not been a Nazi. She had never joined the party, never attended the rallies, never believed the propaganda. But she had also not resisted. She had kept her head down, stayed quiet, tried to protect her family. Was that complicity? Was silence guilt? She did not know. She was not sure anyone knew. Despite the complicated emotions, despite the guilt and confusion, life in the camp continued to improve, especially for Sophie. The child was blooming like a flower given water after drought. Her cheeks filled out. Color returned to her skin. The haunted look began to fade from her eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. She learned English phrases quickly, picking them up from the other children and from the American teacher. "Good morning, please. Thank you. Can I have?" She practiced them with Margaret in the evenings, proud of each new word she mastered. She made friends with other German children in the camp. A girl named Elsa, who was 9 and had lost her entire family except an aunt. A boy named Hans, who was 8 and rarely spoke, but smiled sometimes when Sophie made him laugh. They played together in the afternoons, simple games of tag and pretend, games that children everywhere play when they are allowed to be children. One evening Sophie came running to find Margaret, her face bright with excitement. "Ma, Sergeant Mitchell said he has a surprise for us tomorrow." Margaret looked up from her mending, surprised. "A surprise?" "Yes. He said it's something special. He wouldn't tell me what, but he smiled, so I think it's good." The next day, Sergeant Mitchell appeared in the afternoon with a camera. An actual camera, the kind that took instant photographs. He found Margaret and Sophie sitting outside their barrack in the spring sunshine. "Mrs. Hoffman," he said in his careful German, "I thought you might like to have a photograph of you and Sophie. Something to keep, something to remember." Margaret stared at him, not quite understanding. A photograph? Why would he do this? He seemed to understand her confusion. "My mother always says family is the most important thing. You should have a picture of your family." He positioned them carefully. Margaret sitting on a bench with Sophie standing beside her, the child's hand on her grandmother's shoulder. "Smile," he said in English, and Sophie understood enough to grin. Margaret managed a small, uncertain smile. The camera flashed. The sergeant waited for the photograph to develop, then handed it to Margaret with a smile. "There, so you can remember." Margaret looked at the photograph in her hand. It showed an old woman and a little girl, both clean, both healthy, both alive. The old woman looked tired, but not broken. The girl looked like a child again, not a survivor. It was proof that they had made it, that they were together, that they had survived. Her voice was thick when she spoke. "Danke, thank you, Sergeant Mitchell." He nodded. "You're welcome, Mrs. Hoffman. Take care of each other." That night, Margaret placed the photograph carefully in her few possessions, wrapped in a cloth to keep it safe. She looked at it before she went to sleep, studying the faces of the woman and child who looked like them, but also somehow different, healthier, safer, changed. There were other moments of unexpected kindness. A female soldier who taught some of the women basic sewing machine skills. A chaplain who held services on Sundays for those who wanted them, speaking in halting German about faith and forgiveness. A doctor who spent extra time with the sick children, making sure they got proper care. These were not grand gestures. They were small acts of ordinary human decency. But to people who had expected cruelty, who had been taught that the enemy was inhuman, these small kindnesses were revolutionary. Margaret watched Sophie play one afternoon, running and laughing with her friends, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not happiness exactly. It was too complicated for that. But it was something like peace, or at least the beginning of it. Her granddaughter was alive. They were together. They were safe. Nothing else mattered as much as that. Late at night, when Sophie was asleep in the bed beside her, Margaret lay awake and wrestled with thoughts that gave her no peace. The camp had become comfortable, almost normal. That was what troubled her. How could captivity feel like safety? How could the enemy feel like protectors? She had been raised in a Germany that valued discipline, order, strength. The Reich had promised greatness, had spoken of destiny and power and national pride. And what had it delivered? Ruins. Millions dead, cities destroyed, families scattered, children orphaned. And here she was, an old German woman in an American prison camp, being treated with more dignity than her own government had ever shown her. The contradiction outed her. She had not been political. She had never cared about ideology or power or national glory. She had cared about her family, her home, her simple life. But she had lived under the Reich. She had stayed silent when neighbors disappeared. She had not asked questions when the laws changed, when the world became cruel. Was that complicity? Was silence guilt? She thought about her daughter dead in Dresden. Had she died for something meaningful? Or had she died for nothing? A victim of a war started by men drunk on power and mad with ambition? Margaret did not know. The answers seemed to shift every time she tried to grasp them. And what did it mean that the Americans, the enemy, the people who had bombed German cities and killed German soldiers, were now feeding German children and keeping German families together? What did it say about the world when the victors showed more mercy than the vanquished had ever shown to others? She thought about the photographs she had seen before the war ended, the ones that some soldiers had smuggled into the camp, the ones that showed what had been found in places like Dau and Bergen-Belsen, the skeletal bodies, the mass graves, the horror beyond words. The regime she had lived under, the government she had not questioned, had done those things in her name, in all their names. The guilt was crushing, but so was the relief of survival. She was alive. Sophie was alive. They were being cared for by people who had every reason to hate them, to punish them, to make them suffer. Instead, they were being shown a strange kind of mercy that she did not fully understand, but could not deny. One night, unable to sleep, she got up quietly and walked outside. The night air was cool, fresh. Stars filled the sky above the camp, bright and distant. She stood in the darkness, wrapped in a blanket, and tried to make sense of everything she felt. Can't sleep either. She turned, startled. It was Sergeant Mitchell walking the perimeter of the camp. He had a flashlight but kept it pointed at the ground so as not to blind her. "Too many thoughts," Margaret said softly in German. He nodded as if he understood, though she did not know how much German he really knew. He stood there for a moment, looking at the sky. Then he spoke, his German slow and careful. War is over now. Time to think about what comes next. Time to rebuild. How? Margaret asked. How do we rebuild from this? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, one day at a time, one person at a time. You take care of that little girl. You teach her kindness. That's how you rebuild. But my country, your country, made mistakes, bad mistakes. But you didn't. You're just a grandmother trying to protect her grandchild. That's not a crime. That's just love. Margaret felt tears on her face. You don't understand. We let it happen, all of us. We didn't stop it. Maybe. But you can't change the past. You can only change what comes next. That little girl in there, she's the future. What you teach her now, that matters. He paused, then added quietly, we all have to live with what we've done and what we didn't do, but we can't let it stop us from doing better tomorrow. He nodded to her and walked on, continuing his rounds. Margaret stood in the darkness for a while longer, thinking about his words. They did not solve everything. They did not erase the guilt or the grief, but they offered something she had not felt in a long time. They offered the possibility of moving forward. The women in the camp talked among themselves quietly, carefully, testing the waters of dangerous conversations. In the evenings, when the children were asleep and the Americans had retreated to their own quarters, the German women sat together and shared the thoughts they could not speak aloud during the day. Some were defiant. This is temporary, they insisted. Germany will rise again. We are still Germans. We are still proud. But even they sounded less certain as the weeks passed, as the comfortable routine of the camp made it harder to maintain righteous anger. Others were bitter. We have been betrayed by our leaders, they said. They promised us victory and delivered us to this, to being prisoners in our own land. Their bitterness was at least honest, raw, real. But many, like Margaret, were simply confused. They did not know what to think anymore. The world had been turned upside down. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed had proven to be lies or mistakes, or both. And the people who were supposed to be monsters were treating them with unexpected decency. One woman, Frau Bear, a former school teacher from Munich, spoke up one evening. What if we were wrong about everything? The question hung in the air. No one wanted to answer it. To admit they had been wrong was to admit that the suffering, the death, the destruction had all been for nothing. It was too painful to face. But Margaret heard herself speaking. We were wrong, at least about some things. Maybe about many things. Other women turned to look at her. Some faces showed agreement, relief that someone had said it. Others showed anger or fear. How can you say that? One woman demanded. We are Germans. We cannot betray our country. Our country betrayed us, Margaret said quietly. It promised us glory and gave us ashes. It promised us strength and left us broken. Look where we are. Look at what has happened. Can you honestly say this was right? But the Americans feed us. They give us beds and soap and medicine. They keep our families together. They treat us like human beings. Our own government did not do that. Not at the end. Maybe not ever. The silence was heavy. Then Frau Bear spoke again, her voice soft. My husband died believing in the Reich. He died believing it was all for something. If we say it was wrong, what does that make his death? No one had an answer. How do you tell a widow that her husband died for a lie? How do you strip meaning from sacrifice? The questions were too hard, too painful. So they sat in silence, each woman alone with her thoughts, wrestling with truths too heavy to carry, but too true to deny. But something had shifted. The conversation had been started. The questions had been asked, and once asked, they could not be unasked. Seeds of doubt, of recognition, of painful realization had been planted. They would grow slowly in the weeks and months to come. As summer approached and the weather warmed, the camp expanded its programs. Some of the healthier refugees were taken on supervised trips outside the camp to help with farm work or to attend cultural programs in nearby towns. It was a way to begin reintegrating them into normal life, to help them see that the world still existed beyond the fences. Margaret and Sophie were included in one of these trips. They traveled by truck to a nearby American military base where a small theater production was being held for the troops. The refugees were invited to attend as part of a program to expose them to American culture, to democracy, to different ideas. The play was simple, a comedy about soldiers trying to run a small-town newspaper. The humor was gentle, the message about freedom of the press, subtle but clear. The American soldiers in the audience laughed easily, their enjoyment genuine. The German refugees sat stiffly at first, uncertain what they were supposed to feel. But slowly some of them began to smile. A few even laughed. Sophie, sitting on Margaret's lap, giggled at the physical comedy of the actors. She did not understand all the English words, but humor transcends language sometimes. By the end, she was clapping along with everyone else. After the play, there was food and music. American soldiers mingled with German refugees. The atmosphere surprisingly relaxed. Some soldiers tried out their broken German, making the Germans smile at their terrible accents. Some refugees tried their English, receiving encouraging nods and corrections. Sergeant Mitchell found Margaret and Sophie in the crowd. He had a chocolate bar for Sophie as usual and a cup of coffee for Margaret. "Did you enjoy the play?" he asked in his careful German. Margaret nodded. It was nice, different. Sophie enjoyed it very much. Sophie was already eating the chocolate, her face blissful. Mitchell smiled at her, then turned back to Margaret. "In America, we believe in freedom. Freedom to speak, freedom to think, freedom to disagree. That's what we fought for." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "And us? We are your prisoners. Do we have freedom?" He looked at her seriously. "You're not prisoners. You're displaced persons, refugees. Once the country is stable again, once there are proper systems in place, you'll be free to rebuild your lives. That's the goal. Not to punish you forever, but to help Germany recover and become something better." Better? The word felt strange in her mouth. How? Democracy, rule of law, protection of individual rights, all the things that were taken away. We want to help Germany find those things again. Margaret looked at him, this American soldier with his earnest face and his broken German. She did not know if she believed him. She did not know if it was possible, but she saw in his eyes that he believed it. He genuinely believed that Germany could be something other than ruins and shame. "I hope you are right," she said softly. "Me too, Mrs. Hoffman. Me too." On the truck ride back to the camp, Sophie fell asleep against her grandmother's shoulder, exhausted from the excitement of the day. Margaret held her close and looked out at the passing German countryside. Fields were beginning to turn green again after years of neglect. Wildflowers bloomed along the roadside. Life, it seemed, persisted even after destruction. She thought about the sergeant's words: democracy, freedom, individual rights. These were concepts the Reich had despised, had called weakness, had crushed beneath the boot of totalitarian power. And what had that brought them? Ruin. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps weakness was actually strength. Perhaps valuing individual life over national glory was not decadent but wise. Perhaps the Americans were showing them not just mercy, but a different way of being human. She did not have answers. But for the first time in years, she felt like questions were allowed. That in itself felt like freedom. The turning point came on a Sunday morning in late June. The chaplain who sometimes visited the camp was holding a service. Margaret usually did not attend, uncomfortable with the American style of worship, uncertain about God after all that had happened. But Sophie wanted to go because there would be music, so they went together. The service was held in a large tent with the sides rolled up to let in the morning breeze. Chairs were arranged in rows, and a small organ had been brought in. The chaplain was a middle-aged man with gentle eyes and a kind smile. He spoke in English first, then had someone translate into German for the refugees who attended. He spoke about forgiveness, about mercy, about the difficulty of moving forward after terrible wrongs had been done, about how hate destroys the hater more than the hated, about how healing is possible even after unimaginable pain. Margaret sat and listened, Sophie leaning against her side. The words washed over her, some of them sinking in, others sliding away. She was not sure she believed in forgiveness. She was not sure she deserved it or could offer it. But she listened because the chaplain's voice was calm, and because it gave her something to think about, besides her own constant guilt and confusion. Then he said something that made her breath catch in her throat. "The children," he said, his translator echoing in German a moment later. "The children are not responsible for the sins of their parents or their nation. The children are innocent. They deserve a future free from the burden of the past. They deserve to grow up learning kindness, not hatred. They deserve to know peace." Margaret looked down at Sophie. The child was playing with the frayed edge of her dress, not really paying attention to the sermon. Her face was peaceful, relaxed. She looked like what she was, a 7-year-old girl, not a German, not a refugee, not a victim of war, just a child. And in that moment, Margaret understood something that shifted everything inside her. Sophie was not responsible for any of this. She had not voted for the Reich. She had not supported the war. She had not known about the camps or the atrocities. She was just a child who had been born into a world gone mad, who had lost her parents, who had survived against all odds. And she deserved better than to grow up carrying the weight of Germany's sins. That was why Sergeant Mitchell had helped them. That was why the Americans fed the children chocolate and taught them English and let them play. Not because the children deserved punishment, but because they deserved protection. Because they were the future, and the future should not be poisoned by the past. Margaret felt something break open in her chest. Some hard knot of guilt and confusion and shame that had been sitting there since the day her daughter died. It did not disappear, but it shifted, changed shape. She could not forgive the Reich for what it had done. She might never forgive herself for staying silent. But she could protect Sophie. She could teach Sophie to be better, to know better, to choose differently. That was what the Americans were offering. Not absolution, not forgetting, but the chance to do better next time. The chance to rebuild. The chance to teach the children something other than hatred and blind obedience. After the service, she found Sergeant Mitchell outside the tent. He was talking to some other soldiers, but when he saw her, he excused himself and came over. "Mrs. Hoffman, did you enjoy the service?" She looked at him. This American soldier who had kept his promise, who had made sure she and Sophie stayed together, who had shown them kindness when he had no obligation to do so. She tried to find the words in German, then gave up and said it in English, the words she had been practicing. "Thank you." He looked surprised. "For what?" She gestured to Sophie, who was playing nearby with other children. "For her. For letting us stay together. For keeping your word." For she switched back to German, unable to find the English words. "For showing us that people can still be kind, even to their enemies." He was quiet for a moment, then said in German, "You were never my enemy, Mrs. Hoffman. You're just a grandmother. That little girl was never my enemy. She's just a child. We're not fighting a war against grandmothers and children. We're trying to end a war that hurt everyone, including Germans." "I understand now," Margaret said. "I think I understand what you are trying to do. It is hard, very hard, but I think I understand." He smiled. "That's all we can ask, understanding. And maybe eventually forgiveness for everyone." She nodded, feeling tears on her face, but not embarrassed by them. She had cried so much in the past months. What were a few more tears? But these felt different. Not tears of fear or grief, but tears of something like relief. The relief of laying down a burden she had been carrying for too long. Sophie ran up to her, flushed and happy from playing. "Oma, can I have some water?" Margaret wiped her eyes and smiled at her granddaughter. "Of course, Leeling. Let's go get you some water." They walked together toward the water station, hand in hand. And Margaret felt for the first time since the war began, like maybe they would be all right. Maybe Sophie would have a future. Maybe healing was possible. Maybe kindness was stronger than hatred after all. As summer turned to autumn, the camp began to change. Some refugees were being relocated, sent to other areas where housing had been arranged, where jobs were available, where life could slowly begin again. The American occupation forces were working to rebuild Germany to create systems for displaced persons to find homes and work and stability. Margaret and Sophie received notice in September. They would be moved to a displaced person settlement near Frankfurt, where housing had been prepared for families. There would be schools for children, work opportunities for adults, a chance to begin rebuilding their lives. Margaret felt conflicted about leaving. The camp had become familiar, safe. She knew the routine, knew the people, knew what to expect. The outside world was uncertain, full of ruins and memories and the difficulty of starting over at 68 years old. But she also knew they could not stay in the camp forever. Life had to move forward. On their last day at the camp, Sergeant Mitchell came to say goodbye. He brought small gifts. A new doll for Sophie with real glass eyes and a dress that matched. A warm shawl for Margaret and another photograph, one he had taken the week before of them standing together outside their barrack, both smiling. "To remember us by," he said, "and to remember that you made it through, both of you, together." Sophie hugged him impulsively. This American soldier who had been kind to her. He looked surprised but pleased, patting her head gently. "You take care of your grandmother, you hear? She's pretty special." Margaret shook his hand formally, the German way, but her voice was warm. "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell, for everything, for keeping your promise. I will never forget. Take care, Mrs. Hoffman. Both of you make a good life." The displaced person settlement was better than Margaret had expected. They were given a small apartment, just 2 rooms, but it was theirs, private, with a door that locked and windows that opened. It had a small kitchen where Margaret could cook, a bathroom they shared with 2 other families, and beds that were theirs alone. Sophie started school, a real school with German teachers, but American oversight and American principles. She learned reading and math and science. She also learned about democracy, about human rights, about the importance of questioning authority and thinking for oneself. She learned English rapidly, becoming fluent within a year. Margaret found work mending clothes for a local shop. The pay was small, but it was enough to supplement the aid they received. She was careful with money, saving what she could, planning for a future she had not thought she would have. Life was hard. Germany was rebuilding, but it was slow work. Food was still rationed, though less severely than during the war. Ruins still dominated the cities. Many people still mourned lost loved ones, lost homes, lost futures. But there was also hope. Slowly, painfully, Germany was learning to be something new. Not the Reich, not the Empire. Something different, something perhaps better. Years passed. Sophie grew up. She became a teacher dedicated to educating the next generation about the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of standing up for what is right. She married a good man, a carpenter who had also been a war orphan. They had children of their own, 2 daughters and a son. Margaret lived to see her great-grandchildren, to hold them in her arms and tell them stories. She lived to see Germany transform, to see democracy take root, to see a new generation grow up without the poison of Nazi ideology. She lived to be 92 years old, sharp-minded, until the end. She kept the photographs Sergeant Mitchell had given her. They hung on the wall of whatever home she lived in, a reminder of the worst time in her life, but also of unexpected kindness. When her great-grandchildren asked about them, she would tell the story. About the day she thought she would lose Sophie, about the American sergeant who had promised they would stay together, and had kept that promise. About how kindness from an enemy had been more powerful than any weapon. "Did you ever see him again?" her great-granddaughter asked once. "The American soldier?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I do not even know if he survived the war's aftermath, if he made it home safely to his mother and his niece in Ohio. But I think of him often. I think of him every time I look at Sophie. Every time I see what she has become. Every time I hold one of you. He saved us. Not just our lives, but our future." Sophie, now a woman in her 60s with gray in her own hair, would sometimes add her own memories to the story. She remembered the camp, though not clearly. Mostly she remembered feeling safe after feeling afraid for so long. She remembered the American soldier who gave her chocolate. She remembered her grandmother holding her hand and never letting go. The war taught me many things, Sophie would say, but the most important was what my ma showed me. That love is stronger than hate. That protecting those we care about is worth any sacrifice, and that even enemies can choose to be human. And so the story of Margaret and Sophie became a story that was told and retold, passed down through generations. It was not a story about war, really, though war was its setting. It was a story about what matters most when everything else is stripped away. It was a story about an old woman who refused to let go of her granddaughter's hand and an American soldier who honored that love by keeping a simple promise. In a world that had seen the absolute worst of humanity, in a time when cruelty and hatred and violence had become normal, small acts of kindness stood out like stars in darkness. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell could have followed the regulations strictly. He could have separated the old woman from the child. He could have cited policy and moved on to the next person in line. Instead, he saw two human beings who needed each other and made sure they could stay together. That choice rippled forward through time. Because Sophie stayed with her grandmother, she grew up with love and stability. Because she grew up with love and stability, she became someone who could teach that to others. Because she taught it to others, including her own children and students, those values spread further. One promise kept, one moment of kindness, infinite consequences. This is why we tell these stories. Not to glorify war or suffering, but to remember that even in the darkest times, human decency persists. That even between enemies, compassion is possible. That the choice to be kind, to be merciful, to honor the bonds of love, matters more than we can ever fully measure. Margaret's desperate plea, "Don't take her from me," became a promise kept. "I will make sure you stay together." And that promise became a life lived fully, a family restored, a future made possible. It became proof that the war did not have to destroy everything. That some things, love, family, human dignity, could survive even total devastation. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of what matters most, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories of human connection during history's darkest hours need to be remembered and shared. They remind us that we are all capable of both cruelty and kindness, and that every day we choose which one we will offer to the world. Choose kindness. Choose mercy. Choose to keep your promises to those who depend on you. That is how we honor these stories.